officially call yourself a family office consultant, but tell us a little bit more about where that expertise comes from and how you managed to end up in this field.
My background was actually in the commodity business, but I had known a wealthy family and I helped them to set up and start a family office about 20 years ago. And I thought that it would be very straightforward and easy, that it would just be sitting down and setting up an investment office. You just get some Bloombergs and you get some smart people and you get a tax attorney and off you go. But of course, it was a lot more complicated than that. And it was very quickly realized that the challenges were not only handling the amount of information that the markets throw at you, but you also have to deal with a family. It's also complicated because working in a family office can be very isolating. And you also had to be very protective of the family's privacy and confidentiality. You didn't go walking around town saying that you worked for a family office. So that made getting information very complicated. And information is the coin of the realm in finance.
What kinds of family dynamics emerged for you early on where you were like, okay, these are exactly the kinds of things we need to try to avoid when trying to build a successful single family office?
I think anybody who starts to work in the wealth space, and that's not just family office, but it's also wealth management, they really have to examine, first of all, their own assumptions about what wealth is like. And you also have these attitudes around the people's responsibility to society, people's responsibility to their own family that you probably have never examined. You also are often put in a strange position where you're not really clear on where the authority rests in the family. And sometimes it's actually hard to tell which generation the authority resides in. You definitely don't want to get too immersed in these problems, but there are ways that you can ask questions and there are ways that you can get the family to start sharing stories so that maybe they themselves can get on the same page.
What kind of a burden do you face when you're faced with that kind of an inheritance, like psychologically speaking?
The burden, it tends to manifest itself in fairly obvious ways. The main one that you hear the most is the isolation, is the fact that you feel different and separate from other folks. And that has its own pathology. And so if your parents think that there is something very special about your family and that you are very different, again, the paradox is that might not necessarily help you find your own purpose in life. The three big things that you see is family, love, and work. You have to deal with complications of not only just having a family, but you also have this fortune that also affects and has a sort of a magnetic pull on all of the relationships within the family. The love is finding a spouse, and also I would say that a subset of that is friends, and the other one is work. And you can think of that as purpose as well, is finding meaningful work in your life. The idea that you want to live in that jam jar or that you want to live in a bubble or just live on a cloud is not satisfying.
You talked a lot about the isolation. I was just wondering whether facing an inheritance or being part of an inheritance today is different than it was before, simply because of the way our society today communicates. Do you feel the isolation has become less because there's more access to this?
It has had obvious, tremendous positive effects. This massive global experiment that we're involved in has had huge benefits.
So you were talking about like three dimensions: family, love, and work. What is it that parents do or like that families can do to create like immediately the kind of environment that does not make this into, like a negative experience for the next generation?
Well, the first thing is open communication. And that definitely has changed. You can't pretend to your kids can Google you. And so those particular values around money, the fact that you cover that up within the family and the fact that you pretend that your children will just kind of figure it out for themselves and, well, I'll just wait and give them the money when they're 35. And by then they'll be emotionally and financially, they'll have the financial education and preparation to handle that, is simply not the case. You certainly don't want your kids to end up aimless and decadent. And the way to prevent that is to start them off early with a financial education.
We're experiencing a pandemic world. We're experiencing a world that is confronted with dramatic climate change. So there seems to be a lot on the agenda, both philanthropic and impact investment wise, for inheritors of wealth in the next few decades. Where do you start, like, to find that sort of direction that, your wealth utilization should take? Like, do you have any tips there for our listeners?
One of the problems you see a lot, especially and it's covered in the Inheritance Project, and you certainly see it in wealthy families, is a feeling of guilt, is money that's unearned, and the feeling that they, in many cases, will actually try to avoid it, and try to hand it off to other folks to manage it, or pretend that they don't have it. That can be very overwhelming. And this is often the reason that I hear folks, inheritors, say that they feel guilty. And that's what that guilt is. It's the idea that you're not actually engaging with the challenges of your life. So in the past, the old money trope was, it's my duty to give back as a person of privilege. But the millennials, to some extent, have flipped it around so that the first order of business is to do something that you actually believe in. It's very good to support your community. It's very good to write those checks. It's very good to support the opera and the boys club. But people also want to see real innovation for the big problems of the world, and they want to change. They want to change basically how they give and how engaged they are with it, and not what they're giving to. And that's a very positive thing.
There's a lot of big challenges to our society that we're facing. So technology is the big one, isn't it? Like, especially when you think about the direction investments are taking and how wealth can actually be created now. If you look at the crypto development, for instance, or anything that comes from the blockchain, do you see that as more of a threat or more of an opportunity? Like, how do you see that shaping sort of also the opportunities that we have with wealth in the future?
The crypto conversation, I mean, that's a huge topic. In a very short period of time, we've actually seen an entire financial industry sprout up on the foundation of crypto. And no one's had to ask for any permission, and no one has had to, go through committees or spend years getting tenure or moving up in the organization. They just decide, I'm going to, I'm going to start I'm going to start a bank on the blockchain. And, 3 days later, they have one. It's incredibly encouraging to see how quickly the innovation has happened in that space. Now, how does that affect wealth in the future? Who knows? We've had the dot-com fortunes, and we certainly had the Web 2.0 fortunes. What's really encouraging, especially about the dot-com fortunes and the crypto fortunes, is there's this immediate need to give back. The real old time wisdom about wealth was the idea that you're building responsible stewards, and that you're creating the next generation of leaders. And it would be a real shame if we lost that. I think that's incredibly important. If you have this potential in your family, if you have this possibility, you should cultivate leaders in the next generation, and you should encourage people to take on those roles, and you want to provide them with the tools that they need in order for them to do that.